It was a typical fall morning at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. The historic campus was covered in gold and red leaves as students hurried to their classes. Among them was Barron Trump, now 19, a discreet freshman who, despite his famous surname, was trying to keep a low profile in his first semester. Healy Hall, one of the most imposing buildings on campus, cast its Gothic shadow over the gardens as the tower bells tolled 9:45 in the morning. Barron adjusted the strap of his backpack, checked his phone once more to confirm the location of room 204, and climbed the weathered marble steps. Professor Michael Anderson, who holds a PhD in philosophy from Harvard and is known for his militant atheism, was organizing his notes on the main desk. With his thin-rimmed glasses, worn tweed blazer, and unkempt gray hair, he emanated that typical aura of a veteran academic. He was known not only for his controversial publications on secularism, but above all for his provocative approach in the classroom. The classroom was a traditional amphitheater, with dark wooden seats arranged in an ascending semicircle. The students arrived little by little, some whispering as they recognized Barron. He chose a seat in the middle of the room, neither too far forward to attract attention, nor too far back to appear uninterested. Sarah Chen, an Asian exchange student, sat down next to Barron, offering a shy smile. "You're really him, aren't you?" she whispered. Barron nodded politely, already used to this kind of recognition. At exactly 10 o'clock, Anderson closed the door to the room with a purposeful bang. "Welcome to Philosophy of Religion 101, he announced, writing his name on the board in angular letters. "I'm Professor Anderson, and I promise that this semester will challenge everything you think you know about faith, reason, and reality." He began to take roll call, pausing momentarily when he reached the name Trump Barron. His eyes sparkled with something that seemed a mixture of interest and malice. "Well, it looks like we have a diverse class this year," he commented, putting the list away. "Before we start, I'd like to do a little exercise. Who here believes in God?" About half the class raised their hands, including Barron, who did so discreetly. Sarah, next to him, also raised her hand, albeit hesitantly. "Fascinating," said Anderson, walking between the rows. "In the middle of the 21st century, in one of the most prestigious universities in the country, we still have so many magical thinkers." His voice oozed sarcasm. "Mr. Trump, since we have a celebrity in our midst, why don't you start? Can you explain to us why an educated person still believes in fairy tales?" The room fell absolutely silent. Sarah held her breath next to Barron. Some students began filming discreetly with their cell phones, anticipating a viral moment on social media. Barron remained calm in his seat, his blue eyes fixed on the teacher. Years of growing up in the media spotlight had prepared him for moments of pressure like this. The moment was tense, and Anderson clearly hoped to embarrass the young Trump in front of his colleagues. "Professor," Barron began, his voice surprisingly firm and mature for his age, "do you believe in love?" The question caught Anderson off guard. He adjusted his glasses, a nervous tic his senior students already knew well. "Love is a set of chemical reactions in the brain, Mr. Trump. It's not a mystical entity like your imaginary celestial friend. So can you scientifically prove to me the love you feel for your daughter? Can I see it under a microscope? Measure it in a beaker?" The professor frowned, his fingers drumming on the table. The mention of his daughter took him by surprise. Few students knew about his personal life. The silence in the room was palpable. Professor Anderson quickly regained his composure, his fingers drumming on the antique oak table. The morning sun streamed through the room's historic stained glass windows, creating multicolored patterns that danced on the stone walls. "An interesting false equivalence, Mr. Trump," he said, adjusting his navy blue bow tie. "But love is something we can observe through measurable behavior and physiological reactions. We have extensive studies on the levels of oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin." "Just like faith and religious experience, Professor," replied Barron, maintaining a respectful tone. "Neuroscientists at the University of Pennsylvania, including Dr. Andrew Newberg, can observe brain activity during spiritual experiences, as well as during expressions of love. The patterns are surprisingly similar." The class was fully engaged now. Sarah smiled discreetly, impressed by her colleague's calm. Marcus Johnston, a bespectacled student in the front row, was typing furiously on his laptop, apparently researching the references mentioned. Anderson circled the room, his leather boots echoing on the wooden floor. "I see you've prepared some basic arguments," he said, walking over to his latest model Dell computer. "But let me show you something." He projected a series of slides showing historical atrocities: the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, modern religious conflicts. "How do you explain that, Mr. Trump? Where was your God during these tragedies? Where is your spiritual experience here?" Jennifer Martinez, a Latina student at the back of the room, visibly uncomfortable with the images, lowered her gaze. Other students began whispering among themselves. Barron watched the images for a moment, his face maintaining a serenity that clearly irritated the professor. "Professor, have you ever heard of Lev Tolstoy?" "Obviously," Anderson replied impatiently. "War and Peace, Anna Karenina. What does that have to do with our discussion?" "Then you should know that he was a devout Christian who was also one of the greatest critics of institutionalized religious violence. In his book, The Kingdom of God is Within You, he—" "Don't go off topic," Anderson interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "I'm asking about these specific atrocities." "The question isn't whether God exists," continued Barron unperturbed, "but how humans interpret and sometimes distort faith for their own ends. The same could be said about political ideologies, nationalism, or even misused science, as in unethical medical experiments." Anderson smiled sarcastically, picking up a chalk and writing theodicy on the board in capital letters. "So your God is so impotent that he can't prevent these misinterpretations? What kind of deity allows such suffering?" "You're a father, Professor," Barron continued. "When your daughter Emma was little and made mistakes, did you forcibly stop her from all her wrong decisions? Or did you allow her to learn from the consequences?" A sepulchral silence filled the room. The teacher's face turned visibly red. Few there knew his daughter's name. Sarah held her breath next to Barron. "We're not here to discuss my personal life, Mr. Trump," said Anderson, his voice tense. "We're not discussing your personal life, Professor. We are exploring the nature of love, freedom, and faith. You allow Emma to make her own decisions because you love her, even if sometimes she chooses different paths than you would like. Why should it be any different with God?" The discussion was taking a turn that Anderson clearly hadn't expected. He nervously consulted his Rolex, realizing that he had lost control of the class. "Interesting that you mentioned freedom, Mr. Trump," he said, trying to change tack. "How do you reconcile the idea of free will with an omniscient being who already knows all your choices? Isn't that a fundamental contradiction?" Sarah, standing next to Barron, timidly raised her hand. Her jade bracelets jingled softly. Anderson, eager to change the focus of the discussion, pointed at her. "Yes, Ms. Chen? In my culture," she began, her voice soft but firm, "we have a concept called Yuen Fen. It's like a destiny that allows choices. Like parents who know that their child will probably choose a certain toy, but still let it be their choice. Knowledge doesn't eliminate freedom." Barron nodded in agreement. "And like quantum scientists who can predict the behavior of particles without determining their individual choices, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle shows us that even in the most fundamental physics, knowledge and determinism are not the same thing." Anderson removed his glasses, nervously wiping them with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. His hands were shaking slightly. "You're simplifying complex philosophical issues with sentimental analogies." "They're not sentimental analogies, Professor," replied Barron. "They're examples of how apparently contradictory concepts can coexist. Like a father who is both authority and friend, or light which is both wave and particle." The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus Johnston raised his hand, his glasses reflecting the light from the projector. "Professor, I read here that even Richard Dawkins admitted—" "Enough!" Anderson slammed the table, causing his coffee to spill. "This isn't a theological debate. We're here to discuss serious academic philosophy." The tense moment was interrupted by the shrill sound of the fire alarm. Initially, some students thought it might just be a test, but the smell of smoke soon began to infiltrate the room. "Keep calm," ordered Anderson, his authoritarian posture returning instantly. "Move out in order." As the students headed for the door, Sarah stumbled, dropping her backpack. Her asthma medication spilled out onto the floor. Barron stopped to help her, noticing her gasping for breath. "Are you all right?" he asked, helping her retrieve her inhaler. The smoke was getting thicker. Anderson, who was already near the door, shouted, "Everybody out now!" "Professor," called Barron, "Sarah's having an asthma attack. We need help." Anderson hesitated at the door, visibly torn between his responsibility as a teacher and his instinct for self-preservation. The smoke was getting thicker by the second. I'll get help," he said, disappearing into the corridor. Barron helped Sarah use her inhaler, but the intense smoke was making her condition worse. He looked around, assessing the situation. Georgetown's century-old windows were boarded up, and the only way out was through the now smoke-filled corridor. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered between labored breaths. "You should go." "I'm not leaving you here," replied Barron firmly. Removing his blazer, he dipped it in the bottle of water he was carrying. "Cover your face with this." Just then, they heard a loud crack. Part of the historic ceiling had begun to cave in. The fire was apparently on the upper floor. Barron quickly sent his location on his cell phone to the emergency services, who should already be on their way. Then, surprising both himself and Sarah, he began to pray out loud. "Our Father, we need help now." "I thought your faith was more intellectual," said Sarah, trying to smile between harsh breaths. "Faith isn't just about philosophical debates," he replied, looking for an escape route. "It's about trusting even when everything seems impossible." Through the smoke, Barron noticed something he hadn't seen before. An old book stack, left over from the days when the building served as a library. It was hidden behind a panel that the fire had revealed. "Hang in there," he said, helping Sarah to her feet. "I think I found our way out." Just then, they heard heavy footsteps in the corridor. It was the fireman, followed by Professor Anderson, who had returned with help. "This way," shouted Barron. The firefighters quickly assessed the situation and, using the dumbwaiter as an alternative route, managed to get everyone out safely. Outside, while paramedics attended to Sarah, Anderson approached Barron, who was sitting in an ambulance receiving oxygen. "Why did you stay?" asked the professor, his voice shaking slightly. "It was extremely risky." "For the same reason you came back with help," replied Barron. "Some things go beyond logic and self-preservation. We call it love of neighbor." Anderson was silent for a moment, watching the firefighters battle the blaze, which, fortunately, had been contained before it caused any major damage. "You know," he finally said, "when I saw the smoke, my first thought was my daughter Emma. How would she feel if—" His voice faltered. "Love makes us do things that seem illogical, doesn't it?" said Barron softly. "Maybe," Anderson hesitated, "maybe there really are some things that go beyond our rational understanding?" Sarah, recovering in the seat next to him, smiled. "As a Chinese proverb says, some truths can only be seen through the eyes of the heart." The afternoon sun was beginning to set over Georgetown, casting a golden glow over the historic building. Students and faculty gathered in small groups, processing the day's events. Something had changed, not just in the relationship between Barron and Professor Anderson, but in the general atmosphere of the class. In the week following the fire, the Georgetown campus was buzzing with rumors and discussions. Room 204 was temporarily closed for renovations, and the philosophy of religion class was moved to a modern auditorium in the science building. Professor Anderson entered the room on time at 10 o'clock, but something was different. His usual tweed blazer had been replaced by a well-cut suit, and his posture seemed less combative. "Before we begin," he said, placing his briefcase on the table, "I'd like to touch on the events of the past week." His eyes traveled around the room, lingering briefly on Barron and Sarah. "The fire showed us that theory and practice don't always line up perfectly." The room was completely silent. Sarah, now fully recovered, sat down again next to Barron. She had brought a small jade amulet, a gift from her grandmother, which she held like a talisman. "Mr. Trump," Anderson continued, "your actions have demonstrated something that my theoretical lectures on ethics could never adequately convey, and that made me rethink my approach." Barron nodded respectfully, but before he could respond, Marcus Johnston raised his hand. "Professor, does this mean that you now believe in God?" Anderson allowed himself a small smile. No, Mr. Johnston. It means that I have learned to respect that different people can come to different conclusions about reality and still act with nobility and courage. Jennifer Martinez, who had been disturbed by the violent images in the previous class, raised her hand. So how should we approach the differences between faith and reason? Excellent question, Anderson replied, walking over to the board. Let's examine the concept of complementary truths. In quantum physics, for example, we have Bohr's principle of complementarity. As the professor developed his reasoning, Barron noticed something surprising. Anderson was no longer trying to provoke or ridicule. He was genuinely engaged in an educational dialogue. Sarah leaned over and whispered, "You changed him." "It wasn't me," replied Barron softly. "Sometimes people just need a moment to reconnect with their own humanity." The class discussion evolved into a fascinating debate about how different forms of knowledge, scientific, philosophical, experiential, and spiritual, could coexist and complement each other. "You see," Anderson explained, drawing a complex diagram on the board, "traditionally we see faith and reason as opposites. But what if we saw them as different tools for understanding different aspects of reality?" Marcus raised his hand again. "Like a microscope and a telescope?" "Exactly," Anderson enthused. "Each instrument allows us to see different aspects of reality. To deny one in favor of the other would leave us with an incomplete view." During the break, Emma, Anderson's teenage daughter, appeared unexpectedly at the classroom door. She rarely visited the campus. "Dad," she called shyly, "can we have lunch together today?" The professor's face lit up. "Of course, dear." Turning to the class, he said, "We'll continue this discussion next class. For home, I want you to reflect on moments in your lives where reason and emotions seem to be in conflict and how you resolve this." As the students left, Emma approached Barron. "Thank you for helping to change my father," she said. "He's different at home, too. More open, more present." Barron smiled. "Your father is a brilliant man. He's just rediscovered that there's more to life than we can prove empirically." Sarah, organizing her books, added, "As another Chinese proverb says, the heart has reasons of which reason itself is unaware." "Actually," interrupted Anderson, who had approached silently, "that's Pascal, not a Chinese proverb." Everyone laughed, including the professor. "But wisdom transcends cultures, doesn't it?" The rest of the semester promised to be very different from what anyone had initially imagined. The fire had not only changed the physical location of the classes, but had fundamentally transformed the group dynamic and the teacher's approach. The semester progressed quickly, and the last week of classes arrived with the excitement typical of the end of term. Professor Anderson had announced that instead of the traditional final exam, each student would give a presentation on how their perspectives on faith and reason had evolved during the course. The auditorium was packed that morning. Not only the regular students, but also other professors and even some journalists had shown up, attracted by the rumors about the transformation of the once militant atheist professor. "Today," Anderson began, "we're going to break yet another tradition. Instead of me choosing the order of the presentations, I'll ask for a volunteer to start." The silence that followed was broken by Sarah, who shyly raised her hand. She walked over to the podium, setting up her laptop to project some slides. "My presentation," she said, her voice more confident than at the beginning of the semester, "is about how almost dying taught me how to live." She projected a photo from the day of the fire. "That day, I saw how faith and reason worked together. Reason showed us an escape route, but it was faith that gave us the courage to try." Anderson nodded approvingly, while Emma, who had become a regular presence in class, took careful notes. After several memorable presentations, it was Barron's turn. A murmur of anticipation ran through the auditorium. "When I started this course," he said without using slides or notes, "I expected to defend my faith against attacks. Instead, I learned that the greatest truths emerge from honest dialogue." He paused, looking directly at Anderson. "Professor, you taught us the most when you stopped trying to prove yourself right and started exploring the issues with us." Anderson removed his glasses, wiping them thoughtfully. "But the real climax of this semester," Barron continued, "wasn't the fire or the philosophical debates. It was realizing that all of us, atheists, religious, agnostics, are searching for the same fundamental answers. At this point, something unexpected happened. Professor Anderson stood up. "Mr. Trump, allow me to interrupt you," he said, his voice breaking. "Class, I have a confession to make." The auditorium fell absolutely silent. For years, I used this chair to ridicule faith, not because I was sure I was right, but because I was angry. Anger at losing my wife to cancer, anger at unanswered prayers, anger at a God I said didn't exist. Emma, sitting in the front row, had tears in her eyes. "But this semester," he continued, "I learned something profound. True education is not about destroying the beliefs of others, but about creating a space where different perspectives can coexist and enrich each other." Anderson walked over to Barron. "Your final presentation will be dispensed with, Mr. Trump. You have already taught us more than any speech could." "Professor," Barron replied, "I think we all learn from each other." Sarah stood up. "In my culture, we say that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. But sometimes when the teacher is ready, the student shows up too." The room erupted in applause. Journalists quickly typed away on their laptops, realizing that they had a very different story from the one they had expected to find. Anderson raised his hands for silence. "For the last class of the semester, I propose something different. Instead of more presentations, let's have an open dialogue. No judgments, no prepared arguments. Just people sharing their journeys." What followed was one of the most profound and honest discussions that auditorium has ever witnessed. Atheists talked about moments of transcendence. Religious people admitted doubts, and everyone shared their struggles to find meaning in a complex world. In the last hour of that historic lecture, the Georgetown auditorium witnessed something truly extraordinary. Professor Anderson took a chalk and wrote on the board, "True wisdom." "Before we officially close this semester," he said, "I'd like to share some conclusions I've drawn from this transformative journey." The journalists present leaned forward in their chairs, pens ready. Emma pulled out her phone to record the moment. "First," Anderson began, "I owe you an apology, not just to this class, but to all the students who have passed through my classes over the last 15 years. I mistook skepticism for cynicism and intellectual arrogance for academic rigor." He walked over to his desk and picked up a worn book, an old Bible that had belonged to his late wife, Catherine. "This Bible," he continued, his voice slightly shaky, "was Catherine's most precious possession. After she left, I put it away in a drawer, along with my ability to see beyond the tangible." Sarah instinctively clutched her jade amulet, while Barron watched intently. "But something extraordinary happened this semester," Anderson continued. "Thanks to a fire, which ironically started because of a short circuit in the science lab, and the courage of 2 young students, I rediscovered something I had forgotten, that the truth can have many faces." He opened the Bible to a marked page. Catherine had underlined this passage. "Now we see as in a mirror, dimly. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know as I also am known." "Professor," interrupted Marcus Johnston, "does that mean you've been converted?" Anderson smiled. "No, Mr. Johnston. It means I've learned to live with the mystery, to accept that some questions are more valuable than their answers." Barron raised his hand. "Like a scientist who admits that the more we discover about the universe, the more mysteries we find?" "Exactly," Anderson replied. "True wisdom lies not in having all the answers, but in knowing how to ask the right questions." Emma, who had remained silent, suddenly spoke up. "Dad, remember when Mom used to say that the greatest truths are like love, impossible to prove, but impossible to deny when you experience them?" The entire auditorium fell silent. It took Anderson a few moments to regain his composure. "Yes, dear," he finally replied, "and it took an entire semester, a fire, and an extraordinary group of students to make me remember that." Sarah then shared, "In traditional Chinese medicine, we say that true healing comes when body, mind, and spirit are in harmony. Perhaps true knowledge is like that too, a harmony between reason, emotion, and faith." Anderson nodded. "And that's why I've decided to make a significant change to the curriculum of this course for the next few semesters. Instead of philosophy of religion, it will be called Dialogues on Faith and Reason, an integrative approach." The journalists present began to ask questions, but Anderson raised his hand for silence. "The last word this semester," he said, should go to the two students who inadvertently became my professors. He gestured to Barron and Sarah. Sarah spoke first. I've learned that true strength lies not in defending our beliefs, but in having the courage to question them and still stand by them when they make sense to us. Barron stood up for his final words. And I've learned that sometimes we need to lose our way to find a greater truth. As G.K. Chesterton said, the purpose of opening the mind, like that of opening the mouth, is to close it again on something solid. Anderson smiled, picking up his things. Class dismissed, and remember, the best answers usually lead to even better questions. As the students left, many stopped to hug the teacher or exchange words of thanks. Journalists tried to get interviews, but Anderson just smiled and said, "The real story is not in my words, but in the transformation that happened in this room." 5 years later, Georgetown's main auditorium was packed for the graduation ceremony. Among the guest speakers was Professor Michael Anderson, now director of Georgetown's newly created Center for Dialogue Between Faith and Science. In the front row, Sarah Chen, now a neurosurgery resident, was smiling next to Barron Trump, who had become a respected writer and speaker on interfaith dialogue. Emma Anderson, now a graduate student in philosophy of science, sat next to them. Anderson stepped up to the podium, his hair now completely gray, but his eyes shining with a renewed vitality. 5 years ago, he began, a fire in a classroom changed not only my life, but the way our university approaches the dialogue between faith and reason. Today, I want to share what happened afterwards. He paused, looking out at the audience. Our Center for Dialogue Between Faith and Science has welcomed more than 5,000 students. We have exchange programs with religious and scientific institutions from all over the world. But most importantly, we have created a space where difficult questions can be asked without fear. Sarah smiled, unconsciously touching the jade pendant she was still carrying. Next to it was a copy of her recently published book, Medicine and Spirituality, A Holistic Approach. Dr. Chen, Anderson continued, is now leading revolutionary research into the neurological effects of meditation and prayer. Her work is changing the way we understand the interaction between mind, body, and spirit. Sarah blushed as the audience applauded. And Mr. Trump, Anderson smiled, your books on interfaith dialogue are on the bestseller lists, proving that it is possible to discuss profound topics with respect and openness. Barron nodded humbly. His last book, Faith and Doubt, A Necessary Dialogue, had received praise from both religious leaders and atheist scientists. But perhaps the biggest change, Anderson continued, has been in myself. Catherine's Bible is now on my desk, next to my quantum physics books. Not because I converted, but because I learned that different forms of wisdom can coexist. Emma smiled, remembering the long conversations with her father about life, death, and meaning that had brought the family so close together in recent years. To today's graduates, Anderson continued, I leave this advice. Don't be afraid to question your certainties. Don't be afraid to find truth in unexpected places. And above all, don't be afraid to change. He then revealed a surprise. In memory of that transformative semester, today we are inaugurating the Chen Trump Scholarship Program for Interreligious and Scientific Dialogue. Sarah and Barron looked at each other, surprised and moved. This program, Anderson explained, will provide scholarships for students who wish to explore the intersection between science and spirituality, between reason and faith, between the measurable and the transcendent. At the end of the ceremony, as those present dispersed, Sarah, Barron, and Emma met with Anderson in his office. The old room 204, now completely renovated, had become a meeting space for dialogue groups. Who knew, said Sarah, that a fire could turn on so many lights? As the ancients would say, replied Barron, sometimes you need something to burn so that something new can be born. Anderson took Catherine's Bible and a book on quantum physics from his bookshelf. Different paths, he said, same search for the truth. Emma hugged her father. Mom would be proud. Yes, Anderson replied, looking out the window at the sunset over Georgetown. She always knew that love is the greatest truth of all. And so, what began as a confrontation between faith and reason became a bridge between seemingly opposing worlds, proving that the greatest transformations often begin with the hardest questions.